Right, it's fantastic to see so many of you guys here today. You just need to bear with me for a minute or two. Get my watch out. Yeah, fantastic to see so many of you guys here today. I've had the privilege of meeting one or two of you. Now, I don't know you all, but I've got a sneaking suspicion that you are all here at university to engage your minds. You're here to make full use of your mental faculties, to learn, explore, discover, to search for truth. And that's actually what we're going to do here today. We are going to search for truth. And in particular, we're going to search for any truth that might be found in the statement, how can a good God allow suffering? And to aid us in our search for truth, we're going to initially consider history. Now, you guys all study a wide variety of subjects out there, but I'm fairly confident that by and large, the majority of you will be reasonably familiar with world history. And what I'd like you to do is to think for a moment or two about world history. Think about the various time periods and ages. And whatever major historical event that you have in mind, it's very likely that particular event is in some way tied or linked to considerable human suffering. So if, for example, you were to think of the 20th century, your mind may fix on the two world wars which loomed large over that century. If you were to wind the clock back to the 19th and 18th centuries, your mind may turn, for example, to the transatlantic slave trade. If you were to turn the clock back even further to the 17th and 16th centuries, you may think of various plagues and pandemics which ran rife throughout the world, killing millions of people. Now, we could go back further and further and further, but even with those few centuries that we've looked at, it becomes immediately clear that the history of humanity is filled with suffering. So we've done history. How about geography? I've had the privilege of meeting a geography student out there already. Big shout out to you. I'd like for you to picture a world atlas. Think of the continents and the nations that make up that world atlas. Think of the people who live in those nations. And as you do so, your mind may be drawn, for example, to North Korea. You may think of some of the people living there who live under severe restrictions in terms of their political freedom or freedom of speech. You may then potentially think of a nation like Zimbabwe. And you may think of the historic racial tensions that that country has gone through and the ongoing economic difficulties. You may then think of Syria and the war that has raged there, the millions of people who have been displaced, who've had to flee their homeland, and it is slowly destroyed. The world is filled with suffering. Now, having considered history and geography, let's actually focus on this room. You see, the reality is that for the person to the left of you, and the person to the right of you, and for you yourself, suffering is not just confined to the past. It's not just kind of out there in some other nation, but suffering is a real and present reality in your own lives. There is, in fact, no person who hasn't faced turmoil, hardship, or tragedy. You could say that the common human experience is of suffering. So suffering is real, suffering hurts, suffering makes us question. Now, guys, if this were a court case, our conclusion based on that evidence just presented would potentially be that it is clear and settled. It is unrefutable, if that's even a word, that a good God cannot exist. The evidence is so compelling, so significant, that it's almost a shut case. It's a cast iron case. Suffering is a clear and present reality. Suffering and a good God cannot coexist. Therefore, a good God does not exist. Case closed, end of story. But I'd like for us to pause for a moment and consider good legal process. Now, I have no legal training at all. I'm sure a few of you out there are law students, but I have watched a number of legal dramas. And if you, like me, have watched a few legal dramas, you may have had the experience of watching a lawyer stand up, present evidence, examine witnesses, and draw particular conclusions. And oftentimes, after hearing that lawyer, you think to yourself, I am in full and complete agreement. It's an open and shut case. There's nothing else to be heard. That guy must be right. But then oftentimes, another lawyer stands up and presents evidence, examines witnesses, and then you realize what previously you would consider to be unrefutable evidence maybe isn't quite what you initially thought it was. And maybe the case wasn't quite as simple as you initially thought. So what I'd like us to do is to follow good legal process in that spirit and examine the evidence. Let's see whether it's plausible that a good God could allow suffering. And we're going to do so by considering 4 pieces of evidence. So the first piece of evidence is our reaction to suffering. So when I received a call nearly 6 years ago, whilst at work, to inform me that my 18-month-old nephew had died that morning, completely out of the blue, completely unexpected, well, how do you think I reacted? When I've talked with people who've shared with me their struggles with mental health, how do you think I've reacted? When I've heard from friends who are going through relational and sort of marital breakdown, how have I reacted? Anger, sadness, grief. This isn't right. This isn't the way that things ought to be. This should not be happening. That is our common reaction to suffering. Anger, sadness, grief. That is what it is to be human. My nephew shouldn't have been taken away from us. My friend shouldn't have had the turmoil of going through that marital breakdown. No person should have to suffer with debilitating depression. It's just not right. But why? Why? Without God, what basis do we have for saying that anything is ultimately good or bad, right or wrong? Why should we be so troubled by what we see and experience in the world? Why should we actually expect anything better? Well, let's consider these words from Oxford evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. This is what he says on the matter. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replications, some people are going to get lucky, and some people are going to get hurt, and we won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now, it's actually very hard to say those words. It sounds very bleak. It sounds horrible. But what Professor Dawkins has just described is actually the logical conclusion if there were no God, no good God. Which begs the question, are we actually satisfied with that? Are we content to say that, well, there is no good and no evil, no way that things ought to be. Are we content with that? Are these the kinds of words which we could honestly, hand on heart, say to a friend sat next to us who is dying? Would we honestly be able to say what Richard Dawkins says? I'm not entirely sure. Point of evidence number 2 is our response to suffering. So we've considered our reaction to suffering, now our response to suffering. So what do we actually do with this experience which is so common to all of us? How do we respond to suffering? What do we do? Now, our responses will be varied, we're all different, but it's quite likely that we will seek to distract ourselves from the issue at hand. Now, for you, it might be kind of plowing yourself into endless hours on social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. It might be binge watching a drama series on Netflix. It might be pornography. It might be drink. It might be drugs. It might even be work. But you know, it's as though we would do anything at all, not to be left face to face with our suffering. Now, none of those things just mentioned have any power or ability at all to deal with our suffering, and yet we seem to go back to them time and time and time and time and time again. We know they can't really do anything or help us, but we go back to them. And again, it begs the question, well, why? And I think we at this point, we're able to be helped by some words from novelist and academic C.S. Lewis. Let's hear what he has to say on the matter. The Christian says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably, earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. When we throw ourselves into drink and drugs and sex and all manner of diversions, we are seeking comfort. We are seeking resolution of our suffering. It's as though suffering kind of takes something from us, and what we're looking to do is to almost find wholeness or completeness again. But, well, we never really find it. And that's why we go back to these things time and time and time and time and time again. But if Professor Dawkins were to be believed, there would be no point. We live in a world of suffering. It is expected. Suffering is expected. We should hope for no better. Therefore, we ought just to crack on with life. That's the world that we live in. However, our actions actually indicate that we seem to be more in line with Professor Lewis than we do with Professor Dawkins. It is as though we believe that there actually ought to be better. Things ought not to be like this. And that resolution to suffering is actually to be found. And it's to be found outside of ourselves. We look for resolution outside of ourselves. But what Professor Lewis would say is that ultimately, resolution to suffering is not going to be found in Netflix. It's not going to be found in a bottle of wine, but ultimately, it's going to be found in God himself. Point of evidence number 3. That's God's reaction to suffering. So we've looked at our reaction, our response, now God's reaction to suffering. Now, guys, occasionally in a legal drama, when the evidence is weighty and compelling, the defendant has very little to say. They know they're guilty. They know the evidence is stacked against them. What would they have to say? They keep their mouth shut. And, we might actually expect the same from God on the topic of silence, topic of suffering even. we might expect silence from him. Complete silence on the matter of suffering. What does he have to say? Nothing. But, the reality couldn't actually be any further from this. The Bible is a book which is honest. It's honest, it's frank, it's real, at times it's raw. It gives us a deep insight into humanity and all that goes along with that. Essentially, everything that you'd find in EastEnders or a Coronation Street, you'll find it in the Bible. For example, the Bible contains 66 different books. One of those books is called Lamentations. To lament is essentially to kind of cry out. The entirety of this book is about a man who is crying out to God about the state of his nation. He is not happy, and he's telling God about it. That is in the Bible. Another book of the Bible is called Job. It's named after a man called Job who's had a bit of a horrible time. Well, a very horrible time, in fact. His family have just been killed. They've just died. His livelihood has just been destroyed. And this book of Job is essentially an extended conversation, a very robust conversation between God and Job about his suffering. Job is very real about how he's feeling. So what does God himself think about suffering? We've heard about Lamentations and Job, but what does God himself think about suffering? Well, in the Bible, God is primarily described as a father, and we are described as his children. Now, what good father is not concerned for the lives and the well-being of his children? God hates suffering. Time and time and time and time again in the Bible, God is calling people or telling people to look after the weak and the oppressed. Not to defraud people, not to mistreat foreigners, to care for the poor, to relieve suffering. Same message going out time and time and time again. He cares. He hates suffering. This God of the Bible, is good. Point of evidence number 4 is God's response to suffering. Now, guys, at this point, you may be thinking, okay, well, there may be a distant God out there who cares about our suffering, but this God doesn't seem to be doing much at all, really. God might have some nice thoughts towards us, but how does that actually help me in the situation that I'm in? How is that going to fix the state that the world is in? If God is God and all-powerful, could he not just get rid of evil and suffering and just have it done and away with? Surely. He might be good, but it doesn't look like he's actually God. But we have to ask ourselves that question. How might God actually do that? How might God deal with suffering? And when I think about that question, I realize that suffering is not just perpetrated by a select kind of nasty few out there. It's not just the drug dealers and the rapists and the dictators. But as I think about it, I realize that, well, we all, in some sense, mistreat one another. We all cause one another to suffer. It's both things that we do and things that we don't do at times. We damage one another, God's children. We damage the world, God's creation. This is what Jesus says about the real problem, the root problem in the world. He says this: from within, out of men's hearts come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. It appears as though things aren't quite as simple as we initially imagined. It appears as though dealing with the root of suffering actually has immense implications for all of us. Now, the amazing thing is that this God of the Bible actually makes a way to ultimately deal with that suffering that we hate, whilst at the same time preserving people like you and me who actually cause suffering. So what did he do? Well, God became a man in the person of Jesus. He was born to a virgin, but he was considered by nearly everyone to be illegitimate, which is entirely understandable. This Jesus was a refugee in Egypt in his childhood. He lived under cruel Roman occupation in his nation. His followers left him. His closest friends betrayed him. He was arrested and sentenced on completely false charges with no evidence at all. And he died an agonizing death under torture, hands and feet nailed to a wooden cross in full view of crowds. God knows suffering. But his plan wasn't just to experience a little bit of human suffering so that he could empathize with us. He could just, understand where we're coming from. His plan was about so much more than that. You see, as Jesus died on that cross, he was dealing with the root cause of humanity's suffering, which is our sin. Sin is simply a word. It means the ways in which we turn away from God, the ways in which we seek to live according to our own standards instead of his. And on that cross, Jesus took on himself the evil of the world and took the punishment that we deserve. Now, because of his death on the cross, we can be forgiven by God. We can experience relationship with God. Jesus promises a renewed world, a world free from suffering. Sickness, hunger, war, gone. And it's an offer that he makes to us. So you see, now in the courtroom, we actually find that things have switched around a little bit. We find ourselves in the dock. The evidence is that we are guilty. It's compelling evidence. Jesus is there. He has a perfectly clean record. Perfect. Jesus offers to swap places with us, knowing full well that we are guilty and deserving of punishment. He offers to swap places with us. Now, we can take the offer. We can enjoy the freedom that is rightly his, or we can actually reject that offer. We can seek to defend ourselves against the mountain of evidence. We can seek to take that punishment on ourselves. It's a free offer. So either we serve the sentence or Jesus serves the sentence. But either way, sentence will be served. So having said all of that, why is it that we still see suffering? Day after day after day after day, I see and experience suffering. Why do we still see suffering? Well, one answer, it's not a complete and full answer, but it's patience. God is actually being patient with us. He's giving us an opportunity to respond, to accept that offer from Jesus. That offer won't last forever. There will be a time when suffering is completely and fully dealt with. But every day in this world that we continue to experience suffering is a day that God is being patient with us. God has been patient with me, which I'm glad for. Now, I know it's only been 20 minutes or so, and I have not in any way, I've only really scratched the surface of this subject. But really, I just wanted to give us a few things to kind of to think through, to work through that would help us to begin to think through this particular subject. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Eddie to pop back up, and he's going to direct us in terms of what happens next.
Thanks a lot. Oh, am I on? Cool. Thanks a lot for that. We're going to just have a couple of minutes to let people text in any more questions to the number that's on the screen. So anyone who's got questions now. But the first thing I want to do is direct you to what's on your table. Next to the juice, there should be a little form like this. And this is just a feedback form. It's really good, useful for us to just hear what you think about what we do, about sort of what's being said, the sandwiches, all that sort of stuff. It's good to get a bit of feedback. But also, if something in what Ashley said really spoke to you and you want to find out a bit more, there's some little boxes here that you can tick. And if you put your contact details down, then someone from Christian Union will contact you and tell you about how you can find out a bit more about the stuff the sort of stuff Ashley's been talking about. But it would be good if everyone, just so it's not awkward, just everyone grab one of these and quickly fill in just something about that they thought about the talk, whether they thought the sandwiches were incredible, because they were, weren't they? Or the host was a bit weird. Whatever you want to put, just write it down, just so everyone's writing. So the other thing that's on your table as well, I want to point you to, is this book here. This is free for you to take away. It's Uncover. It's inside it, it's got a biography of Jesus, and at the back, it's got some studies that just help explain what's going on in these biographies, because some weird stuff happens, and it just helps you get through that. And it'd be really good if you've come with someone who is a Christian. I think they would love to read that with you, just to help explain stuff. Otherwise, just take it and read it for yourself and see who this Jesus is. Right, keep on writing, and I'll just get the questions up, and then we can start on the Q&A. Well, there's lots of questions that come in, so I apologise if we don't get through all of them. We're going to finish about 10 to, just so you can get to lectures and whatever. But I've talked to Ashley, and he's cool to stay around at the end, so you can come and chat to him if there's a question's not asked. Sweet. Right. Okay, so the first question we've got is, why can't sex, drugs, and alcohol be used for a bit of harmless fun rather than to relieve suffering?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I think to some degree the answer is there is actually no reason why not. I think, particularly in terms of reference to what I'd said in that talk, I think I was really trying to make the point that ultimately, so I wasn't necessarily saying that those things in and of themselves were bad. I wasn't saying that there was no place for those things in terms of giving us enjoyment. But just to help us to think, well, what is it that ultimately we're expecting from those things? So if we're expecting just some harmless fun, okay, but my experience personally, my experience with other people is that we wouldn't necessarily articulate it this way, but our relationship with those things, occasionally drink, drugs, sex, rock and roll, Netflix, our relationship oftentimes with those things gives the impression that we're hoping that they'll do a little bit more for us than that. That ultimately, these things will relieve our suffering, will make us whole again. Now, we wouldn't use those words, and for many of us, we probably never really thought about it that way. But just consider actually your actions and what's going on there. I don't know if that's a full enough answer. Please, if I answer any of these questions not to your satisfaction, please grab me afterwards and ask me the question again.
Cool, so the next question is, why was your first bit of evidence, what was the first bit of evidence? Was it the fact that you just didn't like it, the thought of it?
I may need a bit of clarity in terms of
why was your first bit of evidence the fact that you didn't like the thought of it? Sorry.
It's in here somewhere.
So the first bit of evidence was about...
our reaction.
Reaction, yes, that's it.
In relation to the first bit of evidence, really what Richard Dawkins was describing, for me, in my opinion, was the logical conclusion if there is no good God in existence. So actually, even if I remove myself from the equation, from the situation, we'll think about, whether we like it or not, The question is, do we live in such a way that that statement actually makes sense? So regardless of whether we like it or not, my belief, my understanding is that, well, none of us really live that way, as if there was no hope, no good, no evil, no right, no wrong. I doubt even that Richard Dawkins himself lives in such a way. Now, I think when he wrote those words, he was earnest. He was absolutely earnest. But he hadn't really thought through the implications for his own life. So I think it's a helpful distinction to make. Whether we like it or not, the question is, do our actions line up almost with what we say or claim?
Great. The next question is, why should God care about our suffering? Why is it the responsibility delivers from human actions?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's such a good question that I'd like to find whoever asked that question later. Yep, got you. We'll have a chat later. Could you actually just say it again for me?
Let me find it again. What was it?
Why should God
Got lots
care?
of questions here. Why should God? Yes. Why should? Oh no, that's a different one. Loads of questions.
I think
there will be
the gist of it,
some left at the end.
if I get it wrong, please do come back at me. I think the gist of it is, why should God care about our suffering? Does that remove or kind of negate human responsibility? Here we are. Why should God care about our suffering? Why is it their responsibility to deliver us from human actions? I think what I'd say in a nutshell is that it is possible for two such things to coexist. So for God to be concerned about our suffering, to care for us, without removing our responsibility towards one another, towards the world. I see no reason to believe that the two can't coexist. Maybe there was something more in that question, which I'm happy to delve into with the guy who asked. But on face value, I'd say that there's no reason why the two can't coexist.
Great. So we've got one. How can a good God allow suffering in the form of natural disasters, suffering to innocent people?
Yeah, really, really good question. So in the talk, I maybe homed in a little bit more on... I didn't really talk about natural disasters. This is a really... the nature of suffering is often misunderstood. There was I think it's actually in here somewhere, situation where Jesus is with his followers, his disciples. They're walking along a road and they come across a blind man, a man born blind from birth. And his disciples ask him the question, well, Jesus, what happened? Who sinned? Why is this guy blind? Did he sin or did his parents sin? And Jesus has to stop them there because they've got an incorrect understanding. They assume there's almost like a kind of karmic relationship of one person does something wrong, something bad happens over here, either directly to that person or to someone that they're related to. The reality of suffering is infinitely more complex than that. So when I talk of the responsibility that we all have, what I'm not saying, and please don't hear this, what I'm not saying is that a natural disaster happens in some nation of the world and it's the fault of someone in this room, for example. That's not how it works. But it is true that the root cause of all suffering is actually this thing of sin. So Jesus describes things this way. Humanity, us, people, we were created by God to relate to God in a particular way and to relate to the rest of creation in a particular way. The world at that point was perfect. There was no suffering, no war, no sickness, no death. Everything was perfect. What had happened was, well, humanity removed itself from that kind of relationship or setup, and the result was everything has become broken. And it's a really crude example, but it's the only thing that springs to mind. A phone, for example. A phone is designed in such a way that in order for it to function properly and go on functioning, it needs to be plugged into a power source. Now, you're completely free to not use that power source, to take your phone away, but what will happen after a while? The phone will cease to function. The phone will essentially die off. So what we see in terms of, I suppose, natural disasters is almost a breakage of that ideal order of things, of humanity in relationship with God, and humanity in right relationship with God, humanity in right relationship with the rest of creation. And what Jesus promises actually at the end is that that will all be restored. So we currently live in a situation where the world is not as it should be. Things don't work as they should be. We're in a situation where the way that we relate to God is not as it should be. But what Jesus promises and looks forward to is a time when that will all be restored.
Great, thank you very much. It's 10:02, so it's really, so if you need to leave for lectures, you can go now. But I'll just ask one last question, which I thought was really good. The rest of the questions are really good too. But yeah, just come down to the front and chat with Ashley afterwards if I've not been able to ask them. How do I have a conversation with God just like Job did? How do I speak to him, and how does God answer?
Such a good question for right at the end. I think whoever asked that question, I would love to have a conversation with you at the end. Just in short, what I would say is just talk. I know it sounds strange, crazy. Just talk. Be honest. Be open. You might feel a little bit weird, but it's what Christians or the Bible would describe as prayer. There's nothing particularly fancy about it. Prayer essentially is talking to God, being honest with God, being real with God. I'd love to talk to you, whoever asked that question, a little bit more in terms of the dynamics of that, but in essence, we can all have that conversation with God that Job did.